Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the Ed Wood Summit podcast. I believe that we're into the double digits now, Joe. I believe this is podcast number 10. So we started this off in January, and Joe joined me as well as a few of our other Ed Wood colleagues and friends in the first summit. And since then, we've gone in a few different directions, but Joe and I have come back regularly to talk about Ed's textual work. And previously, we reviewed 3 of his paperbacks. And fairly recently, Joe and I are members of a private Ed Wood Facebook group, and the founder of that group happens to be the gentleman who is also, what would you say? He's the proprietor? I don't know what the right word for it is, of the Kathy Wood estate, Ed's widow, Kathy.
I think the term he uses is co-heir.
Okay, that's
co-heir
accurate. That's better.
Of the Kathy Wood, and therefore Ed Wood estates. And he's sort of the as close as you can get to the official keeper of the flame of the Ed Wood estate.
Indeed. And what he's done on that score over the course of the last 3 or 4 years is he has released 2 books through Bear Manor.
Well, one was
Publishing.
OR. Yes, the first one was OR Press, and then the second was Bear Manor. And they're incredible books that if you haven't gotten them, please do.
Yeah, for sure. And Joe has actually reviewed every story at Ed Wood Wednesdays. You can go find them there. Every single story in both of those volumes. Bob is working now on a 3rd volume. And recently in the Facebook group, he had purchased another magazine that he thought suspiciously might have some of Ed's work in it. And he floated a little bit of the text out there and then privately shared with Joe and I the whole entire story. And I said to him, I said, me and Joe would like to review that if you're cool with that. And he was cool with that. So we appreciate that. We definitely appreciate that. Presumably this story could end up in a future volume if Bob continues to do this.
I hope he does.
I do too.
Yeah, these books I think are really the best way to get these stories and articles. I think in the next one he's actually planning on publishing some of the articles as well, that are not just the stories. And it's so much easier than what Bob is doing, which is going through eBay, I think, and just buying these magazines one by one at pretty high cost sometimes. So it's so much easier just to buy volumes of these things all at once.
Oh yeah, you're gonna be lucky to get a volume of a Pendulum mag that somebody doesn't know there's an Ed Wood work in for $30 or $50. You might luck out and get one for somewhere in the range of $50, $70, something like that. But you could pay, depending on the issue, depending on how much clear Ed Wood work there is, depending on if it's has a couple of short stories actually credited to Ed. You could be paying into triple digits easily for these magazines. So yeah, this is a pretty heroic lift that Bob has done to collect. I know a few other guys who have collected the Pendulum magazines to this extent, but Bob has obviously taken it, as Joe said, as keeper of the flame to the next level and made them publicly available for all of us, which is absolutely phenomenal. And so let's wind back a little bit, Joe. So I mentioned Pendulum Publishing. So if we talk a little bit about Ed's work in the magazine industry, this is what he is generally known for. Pendulum Publishers was a sex magazine, or a sex publisher. They published both paperbacks as well as sex magazines, also socio-sex paperbacks. We've talked actually on previous summits here about quite a bit of elements related to all of that. And Pendulum incorporated on April 18th, 1968 in California. Gentleman's name was Bernie Bloom, who incorporated Pendulum, and it was the West Coast operation. So there had already been previously existing an East Coast operation out of Atlanta, and in fact, Pendulum Publishing had been founded by a gentleman named Michael Thieves, which I always find that the pun in that name quite interesting, because Michael Thieves ultimately ended up on the FBI's 10 most wanted lists. By the early 70s, he ended up in jail ultimately, and he was convicted of arson, murder, other things. So go ahead.
No, it's a fascinating story to me. You know, this, to think that West Coast porn and the mafia were working so closely together, and you had to, because that was how you got your stuff distributed. Yeah. And how this connection to Thieves and to organized crime, I think, was a necessary evil of being in the adult business, and not something necessarily that the Blooms were particularly proud of. And I think they tried to live down in later years. But, you know, if you wanted to be in that business, those were the rules. That's how you did it. So, yeah, so I've been watching, you know, these Scorsese, mafia movies lately, and I can't help but think of, you know, somebody should do Porn Fellas. You know, there's Goodfellas. Somebody should do the porn version. But I'm glad that Bernie was there to fund, you know, Ed's work during this time, because he's given us this rich body of work to study and read and enjoy. I'm just glad all this stuff exists, even if you know, if Eddie had to write it for porn magazines, I'm still glad it's out there, because it's for us to read.
It's a staggering amount of work. So jumping back to the mafia real quick, yeah, you had to. The mob had owned the distribution network, and in fact, by the early 1970s, I won't get too far off track, but my friend Jack Descent was printing for the mob in the early 1970s and told me a lot of wonderful stories. So you're right, Joe. There's a great Porn Fellas film out there for sure, and a lot of really colorful stories. But yeah, it gave Ed an opportunity to just write at fever pitch. The resume that was published in Cult Movies magazine that he had written, that Fred Olin Ray paid him to write not long before he passed in 1978. In that article in Cult Movies, Ed notes that he wrote upwards of 1,000 short stories and articles between the early 1960s and that point, which is very close to the end of his life. So it encapsulates close to, the whole entire body of work. Now, the rub there is, as I mentioned, Pendulum Publishing doesn't incorporate on the West Coast until spring of 1968. So the rub is what's going on in the first half and through the mid 60s. We know he started writing paperbacks at least as early as 1963. I'm not going to get way off on another tangent, but I got a magazine in the mail just about less than 2 hours ago, and I only had a chance to cursorily scan it thus far, but a specimen of a magazine from 1963 that I'm quite confident has some Ed Wood work in it, and that's a vein that I've been delving into for a couple of months now with another colleague of mine, and we'll have some more to report back on that in a future summit. So taking it back pre-Pendulum, but with Pendulum, you're talking about, it's not only Pendulum, they're also Calga Press, which stands for California and Georgia, the two merging together. So there's Calga, and eventually Bernie Bloom is able to go independent once Michael Thebus gets into hot water and starts up his own publishing arm called Gallery Press. And he has a couple of sort of shadow presses that he starts to develop. So Pendulum and Calga both bite the dust and stop publishing distinct issues and imprints and titles in 1973. But the magazines persist, and Ed persists in writing for them through EduSex magazines and Sex Press, SECS Press magazines, and then even Gallery Press. And that even transforms ultimately into the Swedish erotica magazines and the shadowy triple dot magazines between the Gallery Press magazines and Swedish erotica. So 1,000 short stories and articles is very easily. It doesn't seem like an exaggeration.
No, that is
not at all.
Because in these magazines, there are the short stories that are now being collected into these books, but he would also just write, the editorials that were on the contents page. He would write several articles per issue. I think the issue that we are discussing today was from a magazine called, what is 2+2?
2+2, which I'm kind of puzzled by I know the theme, according to the editorial of the magazine, is lesbianism is now a quote unquote deviation. It's still mentioned. It's a deviation and it's now accepted. Why you would still call it a deviation if now it's socially acceptable, I don't really know. But that it's a magazine about lesbianism storming into the mainstream and becoming acceptable. So where the title comes in, 2+2, 2+2 = 4, obviously, but it's not computing with me.
I don't know, maybe two lesbians having sex with two other lesbians. I don't know.
It could be.
He doesn't have anything. But a lot of these magazines that Bernie was publishing, each one would have somewhere, I guess, were just generally just sex, but a lot more were focused on some specific aspect of it, like some specific act or lesbianism, or there were, things that you could wear during sex or things that you could use, and Ed would write stories, usually trying to work in the specific theme, and sometimes just barely. There was like a Garter themed magazine, I think, somewhere in
Garter
there.
Girls.
Garter Girls.
Also a loop series, by the way. Also a loop series. Yeah.
So, and I think Ed, he might not have even mentioned the Garters in one of his stories for them, but I never understand his when he's writing for homosexual magazines, when he's writing for gay magazines, he often presents homosexuality in kind of a negative light, or the characters are sometimes made to look foolish or are caught and embarrassed or disgraced in some way. So I never know like what the gay readers of those magazines would get from Eddie's stories. I don't think that they would enjoy them that much. But this time we have a lesbian story, and I was wondering if I don't think this magazine was at all marketed towards actual lesbians. I think the people who were supposed to buy it were straight guys.
But sure. In fact, the editorial is aimed directly at the straight male population. The editorial itself in 2+2.
And I don't know how much they would. I don't even know how much the straight heterosexual male crowd would get out of this particular story. It doesn't have that much in that to offer them.
Well, that's a good point. Ed had an enormous amount of freedom, obviously, to write virtually anything he wanted to write. And if you look at the 2 volumes that have come out of his short stories thus far, or go to Edward Wednesdays and read Joe's reviews of every one of those short stories, you'll find a lot of pulp fiction, a lot of very violent stuff, a lot of stuff that kind of clashes in the context of a sex magazine. So he had a great deal of freedom. And so yes, there was Garter Girls. There was also the Pendulum was the first magazine that Pendulum put out, called Pendulum, and it was a swinger magazine. Pendulum.
Yeah.
Right? So clever, very clever. So upwards of, just to close the loop on the historical aspect of it before we really get deeper into the short story, upwards of 645 magazines were copywritten by Pendulum from 1970 through 1975. You'll find that I indexed all those on Edward Wednesdays as well. And I managed also to index through a little deeper research, 68, 69 timeframe. So approximately 700 or so Pendulum / Calga / Edusex / Gallery Press, et cetera, magazines, not even including the Swedish erotica magazines, which there were a great many of, and that's a whole other complicated story for another day. So we're talking about a vast body of work here. So this particular story is just, it's a pebble on the beach, so to speak. So let's jump in. So it's called Last Laugh, this particular short story, and it's credited to Shirley Lane. So let's talk a moment, Joe, about Shirley Lane.
Well, obviously, Shirley is the name of Ed Wood's own drag persona. When he would dress as, when he would dress in drag, Shirley was the persona that I guess he would claim most often. Yeah. And what surprises me about the Shirley persona, when you hear other people describe Ed as Shirley, they would always say he looked terrible. He looked like very disheveled, everything, like the makeup was bad and the clothes were bad. But Shirley, in his films and stories and novels, and usually is the feminine ideal. The Shirley characters are oftentimes like irresistible to men, and they always look perfect. And so that's a contrast there, is that Ed is so exacting in the way he depicts his Shirleys, but when he depicts Shirley in real life, it's just, I guess, anything he has anything he has in the closet to wear. And so he doesn't do very careful cross-dressing, but and then he just works the name Shirley into the gosh, he works Shirley into things so often that you almost stop noticing it because it's just
right.
It's just one of those things like rants again, where there's a Shirley and a rants in every single one of these stories. But
yeah.
Does Lane have a significance, by the way?
Well, I have a speculation on this, as a matter of fact, and it's far flung, very far flung. But having gone on this is years ago, but it was a rather chaotic quest to find anything. So I went through the Poughkeepsie High School yearbooks rather extensively, looking for Ed, and found some evidence. And again, a story for another day. But the year that Ed was in 9th grade, I believe that would be 1940. Again, fact check me on that. Round about 39, I believe 40, because he ultimately dropped out of school, I think halfway through 10th grade or halfway through 11th grade. Again, I'd have to, this is years ago that I did this research. But in one of the yearbooks, I believe the 1940 yearbook, when Ed is in 9th grade, there's a senior at Poughkeepsie High School named Shirley Lane. So, curiously enough, the Poughkeepsie High School yearbooks, for whatever reason, printed the home addresses of the students in the yearbook next to their photo. So the home address for Shirley Lane just happens to be right in a very tight, circumscribed vicinity where Ed's dad and family moved around pretty much throughout his whole entire upbringing in Poughkeepsie. So he was very close to her in geography always. Presumably he would have known who this person was. Her picture in the yearbook, she looks like a very smart, very sort of put together type of person. I believe she has a nice hat on, and she's looking very confident. If you look at these old yearbook photos, you're like, how much did people age by the time they were 7? They look like they're they're 40 years old.
Yeah, and they all look old because life was harder back then. You know?
That makes sense.
Well, that makes sense. You mentioned that they mentioned the addresses to people. That's something that blows my mind about old newspaper articles, that they will just mention people's home addresses for nothing. You know, like they'll mention crime victims' home addresses. And I was like,
right.
Oh my gosh, what are you trying to do? What are you trying to get these people like killed or stalked or something? So, yeah, that was...
So again, Shirley is spelled Shirley Lane. The real Shirley Lane from Poughkeepsie is Shirley, which is actually my mom's name, the way and the manner in which it's spelled, as a matter of fact, curiously enough. So, but Shirley Lane in his fiction, when he's uses it as a pseudonym, Ed generally spells it Shirlee. So as he does here. Now, as we've heard other Ed Wood sort of aficionados speculate, does he use certain pseudonyms when he's writing within a certain lane? No pun intended. But is Shirley Lane, in other words, because you mentioned, it's his drag persona, he doesn't. Joe already gave that away. He doesn't, because there's no drag aspect to this particular story we're going to talk about, Last Laugh. He just grabbed some common pseudonyms and recycled them many, many times over, as well as, I speculate, a ton of pseudonyms that we may never know. The earlier Pendulum magazines from 68 and 69, even into 70, they generally, all the texts are without credits. So that makes it a little bit more of a heavy lift in terms of researching it and figuring out if it really is Ed. But
well, yeah, the way that Bob Blackburn has been assembling his books is by correlating the magazines against one of Ed's own writing resumes. Right. And the only problem with that is that Ed doesn't list everything on the writing resume, so you never know. This particular magazine featured at least one more article that I'm positive was by Ed, because it's under my favorite of Ed's pseudonyms. Right. The funniest, I think, of Ed's pseudonyms, which is Angora, and it was a story, I think, about
Women's Lib, right?
Women's Lib, yeah, it was
a fresh look at Women's Lib. That's another something.
Another insight to Women's Lib by Angora. And then, so the two of these, the rest of it is called Two on a Rug, Bosom Buddies, Last Laugh, and then Juno's Pickup. And we were speculating that it's very, very possible that Ed wrote all that stuff. So
right, and Juno's Pickup, does that sound like a Juno and the Paycock sort of pun, right? I would think,
so right? It's very possible that Ed wrote all of this, but
I would think so also.
But Last Laugh I would go as far to say as not only is it Ed, no one but Ed could or would have written this. And I think you would have also been able to identify this as Ed's work without any byline, without any headline, without any context. Just the text of the story alone is so quintessentially Ed Wood that no one else could or would have written this thing.
He was really, I agreed, he was really in a place at this point. He was at the peak, perhaps one of the peaks of his productivity, or at the tail end of the peak of his productivity. I kind of speculate by 1966, 67, he's really ramped up his paperback production to fever pitch, and 67, 68 timeframe is the years in which he releases the most paperbacks. Again, we also know, but we don't know the full extent of it, to what extent he's writing in magazines. I don't want to go back on that, but at Golden State News, a big, huge distributor that distributed pornography through a whole ton of imprints. They bought content from others. They produced a lot of their own content. Bernie Bloom was a managing editor there, and Ed Wood was a staff writer there. So when Bernie this is how the story goes. When Bernie started Pendulum Publishing, he took Ed with him to Pendulum, and he became his first staff writer. He knew how by this point already, he knew just how productive Ed was. So Ed has written a lot of things in the mid 60s up to this point that we don't really know that much about. But by 1972, given the resume you cited, Joe, he's writing a ridiculous amount of material. It's almost hard to fathom that one individual could write this much material.
Ed was just incredibly prolific and just incredibly able to produce text, just volumes and volumes of it, and within a very short amount of time. And that, I think, was the thing that endeared him to Bernie more than anything else. Was it just reminds me of in every household, you have certain appliances and power tools and things, the ones that work. Oh, like get the good knife, use the good mixer on this one. And that was Ed Wood. He was because there was other people who worked for Bernie, and sometimes they were just young guys who were just passing through. Maybe didn't even take the job all that seriously. There was apparently a little scandal of them plagiarizing some work and putting their own name on it, and then they all got fired. And but Ed was like that, electrical appliance or power tool that would just work every time. You didn't have to worry about it. You just set it and forget it, or you just turn it on and it works. And that was Ed, and he could just turn this stuff out. So
he's a severe alcoholic at this point, needless to say. So it's astonishing that he's able to function at this high level of creativity.
And still really maintain his personality. His personality is really what shines through, especially in a story like Last Laugh. Last Laugh is, I think, it gives you a little insight into how Ed's mind works, and how he feels about men and about women and about relationships, about marriage, about kids. All this stuff gets into his writing. Do you want to give a description of what Last Laugh actually is?
Sure. So it's a story about a woman named Laura. And Laura is a young lady who is just embarking on the world I presume, after graduating high school. She's out first year on the job, working as a secretary. She finds men, quote unquote, repugnant. But nonetheless, she feels pressured by her family. She lives in upstate New York, curiously enough. She's pressured by her family to why are you 21 years old and you still haven't gone out and gotten married yet, Laura? There's people are going to think things, and there's something obviously wrong with you. And in fact, she she's a lesbian. She discovers this in the gym stall when she's in high school, when she is it's not written this way, but when she's assaulted by an adult, sexually assaulted by an adult, that's what happens. So we'll get a little deeper into that, but going back to real quick, the narrative. So she ultimately does decide, well, I will go ahead and superficially try to put this show on. And she marries a gentleman named Eddie Traynor, who comes from a reasonably wealthy family, and he's a respectable guy. And she longs, though, for the girls in the city. She goes into the city and on the weekends, and she can be herself. And she longs for girls like Marcia and Thelma and Jeannie, who treat her like the quote unquote fluff she wants to be, and identifies herself as, unlike the brutes, the manner in which men paw and treat women. And so ultimately the relationship between her and Eddie goes kaput, and then there's a sting in the tail, the turnabout ending, which
Yeah.
you can see coming about 78 miles away if you're an Ed Wood fan. Yeah, in fact, we'll get in.
Well,
I gave a fairly detailed description of the plot, but didn't give away all the spoilers just yet.
no.
But as we get deeper into the particulars, there's a moment, I'm sure it's the same moment for you, Joe, when you just know exactly what's going to happen at the end.
Well, you always know in most of Ed's stories that there is a twist coming. I call them the O. Henry of the damned. You know, that's who he was, because there's always that twist at the end. And he is at least sober enough or conscious enough of what he's writing to at least set it up, even if he sets it up in a kind of ham-handed way.
Right.
But he does set up his twists. And there's always that reversal of fortune at the end. And frankly, I'm a little disappointed if there's not one in one of his stories, if there's not a twist. So you're always hoping for the twist.
I think we're giving away a little bit of our evaluation. You mentioned ham-handed, because I utterly agree. Yeah, if there hadn't been a twist, it wouldn't feel right at all. But this particular twist, yeah, it's not as compelling as often it is in other Ed short stories. But there's still much to savor here. So so now let's go through this in greater particularities. So Laura, well, go ahead.
Well, I would say, Laura is our main character here, and she is sort of Ed's portrait of a woman. Ed likes to divide lesbians. His idea of lesbians is there's two categories. There's fluff and there's bull dykes. Those are the two, and he uses those terms all the time, fluff and bull dykes. And I don't know too many people who use fluff in the sense that Ed uses it. I think that's a term that may be native to Ed. And, but he also means, sometimes he uses fluff meaning like actual, like something like a fluffy material or something like Angora. He'll describe that as being fluff, feathers, furs, and fluff, and the finery. But I took Laura to be a vain character, a very shallow character, very manipulative, very uncaring person, very unsympathetic. She is using people. She's using Eddie, a trainer. And then Eddie himself is just a dope. Eddie is this idiot.
Horny guy.
Well, I think what's funny here is that even though he is a straight man who marries a lesbian, that would maybe be like an emasculating situation. So Eddie makes sure that that Eddie Trainer is a man's man. This is another one of Eddie's manly man type characters. And he's super potent. He's great in bed. He is a sexual dynamo. Yeah. And just the fact that he married a lesbian does not speak ill of him. The only thing that speaks ill of him is his stupidity. And the predatory character of Miss Henderson, the gym teacher, I assume she's teaching gym. She reminds me so much of, Eddie has her described as a fat slob character, which reminds me of Hose Nose Kate from, the Hose Nose Kate loves Cattle Ann, loves Calamity Jane, or whatever that story is called. This is a hugely long title. And there was another Ed story about, an old bull dyke lady who is, or forcing herself on all secretaries in an office.
Baiting Millie, I think.
Baiting Millie is that one. And secretary is a classic Ed Wood job for ladies. Secretaries are always, getting into hanky panky with the boss or with coworkers. he did a whole movie, The Cocktail Hostesses, about Renee Bond being a secretary who gets into being a cocktail hostess. And I couldn't help it, but whenever Laura and Eddie are arguing, I kept thinking of them as Renee Bond and Rick Lutz. I was thinking if this were like a short story, like a movie or short film or something, I would have Renee as Laura and Rick as Eddie. They have these kinds of conversations where, you know, Eddie says to her, you know, a guy doesn't like to make it with a garbage pail, which is that wonderfully stilted conversation that you only really get in Ed's stories and films. So it's what you're hoping for people to say things like that. And I was thinking, oh, wow, this is just like one of those arguments that Rick and Renee would have from Necromania, and later they fight in the Snow Bunnies. You know, they're always they should have seen their breakup coming, because they're always fighting in the movies. So yeah, that's what I thought. I thought even though I think if there's a character that Eddie kind of wishes he were, I guess maybe it's Laura. I don't know, because she's this ideal of femininity. You might think that he sympathizes with Eddie Traynor because he seemed to have named Eddie after himself.
You're anticipating so much of exactly what I thought. So we're entirely on the same page. By the way, Joe and I didn't discuss this prior, so it's not like we sat down and compared notes or something like that.
No, not at all.
So I love the idea of Renee and Rick playing Eddie and Laura. I agree. I immediately thought very quickly early on in my first read of the story, Ed identifies with Laura. Reason being, thematically, Laura has to lead a sort of a false, inauthentic life on the surface. Yeah. So that's the thematic I think that he identifies with, and it's a powerful thematic actually that infuses all of his work. But I agree where the story is a bit perhaps torpedoed is Laura is very unsympathetic, as you said, Joe. She's hard to like, hard to connect to, and it's also worth noting this is told in third person, but it's largely told from Laura's point of view. So we don't learn everything you said about Eddie is pretty much encapsulates all we know about Eddie. We get largely, her point of view through the story, for good or ill. The garbage pail argument actually is a little bit deeper into the story. When I say deeper into the story, this story occupies a mere 3 magazine pages, by the way. It's short. It's very brief. You could read it in the space of less than 10 minutes, no doubt. Yeah. And but by that point, the garbage pail argument for Laura, by that point in the story, that's a win for her to have pushed Eddie to that point where he feels that unattractive to her, because she's trying to accomplish that a little bit later into the narrative. But winding back real quick, it's early on, I believe it's within the first or second paragraph, where she said, since that first time I was taken in a gym stall by Miss Henderson, the old bull dyke, I realized I was a lesbian. And so that right out of the gate, she's a high school kid, the old bull dyke. It doesn't say Miss Henderson's a teacher or the gym teacher or anything, but you have to presume it, right?
But I think that's another stereotype is women's gym teachers, female gym teachers being lesbians. Right. On The Simpsons, there's a character at Springfield Elementary called Mrs. Pummelhorse, and and I think in the Porky's movies, there's the Miss Ball Breaker or whatever her name is, and that's an old stereotype of the lady gym teacher being a lesbian.
You remind me, and this is certainly not going to name names, but there was a female gym teacher when I was in junior high school, in the first or second year I was in high school, and ultimately I don't remember the details, but I ultimately think they might have kind of washed their hands of her, because I remember there was a different female gym teacher for the last couple of years I was in high school, because the story went from the time I was in junior high up until roughly 9th grade or so. The story went that she frequently ogled the girls in the locker room. So to your point, the stereotype. Did that really happen? I don't know, or was it a perception? She was, let's be, frank here, she was a bit mannish in her demeanor. That doesn't mean that she did that, but that again, I'm a old enough to know that things have changed rather dramatically, and in some ways, and in many ways they have not. But we're talking about the early 1980s that I'm going back to, so we're talking about nearly 35, 40 years ago. But in any case, Laura then starts to make a decision fairly early on to acquiesce and to become, at least superficially, the person that her family and the social norms pressure her to be.
Yeah, and there, I guess, is the one area where we can sympathize with Laura. She has sort of like Alan, Glenn or Glenda, Alan Ann, who goes into the army, and then there were the weekends for his particular diversions or whatever it was. That's the one place where we can sympathize with Laura, is that she has to pretend to be straight to appease her family. The thing that undermines it, though, is that she also has this financial motive. She's already like thinking like 3 steps ahead and like what how this is going to work. So that again, there's a little bit, every sympathetic thing, it's like probably 2 or 3 unsympathetic things about Laura. So you can sympathize with her having to pretend to be straight, but then the fact that she pretty quickly decides, oh yeah, I'm gonna scam Eddie Traynor here and drain his bank account.
Right. Worth noting as we move through that early portion of the narrative that we get descriptions about Laura's take on raising a family, which are very vivid and very bleak, and talking about the kids crapping their pants. And you mentioned slobs earlier, beasts, men are repugnant. This story is very, very
anti-family,
misanthropic. It's anti-family. It's anti-human beings, and to some degree.
Well, that horror of having children and babies and them being unsanitary and running around the house and destroying everything, that is very much Ed. That is something that comes up in at least 2 or 3 of Ed's short stories, where women and men are horrified at the prospect. And I think he's called them yard apes, I think is the term that he's used for children. So that must have been something that was very much Ed's philosophy on having kids, is that, there's these unsanitary, disgusting creatures who are running around, destroying everything in the house and making your life a misery. And you can't really get much more Ed than that. And comparing men to beasts, men are all beasts. Men were such beasts, she says. Well, that's another phrase that comes up, not in just the short stories, but in the movies too, where the characters, when women characters get together, one of the things that the female characters do in Ed Wood's movies, like The Class Reunion and Cocktail Hostesses, is they'll complain about men. They'll sit around the kitchen counter or something and say, "Oh, men are so disgusting. Men are such beasts." Yeah. So that was where if I had been unsure of, Eddie's authorship, I would have said, "Well, now we're in familiar territory here, because this man bashing stuff and this kid bashing stuff, that's so Ed, you could cry."
Right, indeed. And let's take a step back, Joe, and let's take a step back to the presumably largely straight male audience who would have purchased this magazine. They read this story and they're portrayed this way. The audience is being portrayed in this it's not even a negative light. Again, it's a brutal portrayal of
disgusting.
Yeah, right. So that's slapping your audience right in the face, very, very hard, and which is fascinating. But so she has started now her plot is started to formulate in her mind, which is, I will put up this front to, as you said, take Eddie Traynor for a ride. His family has a little bit of money, and then I'll be all set. I can move to the city, and I can enjoy myself with my coterie of lesbian friends. But she knows she's going to have to get to a point of divorce, right? So she's already starting to plot to herself. She doesn't need to be, she knows she's going to some degree be stained by the idea of divorce, but she thinks she can survive through it, that she won't become sort of considered the Scarlet Woman. And
I love that term. He uses
right.
it at least twice in the book. He uses it at least twice in the story, Scarlet Woman. I was like, oh my gosh, this is another era.
Right, right.
Scarlet Woman, wow. But the plan that we'll get into it, but she comes up with a plan for getting through her marriage and getting to that divorce point, and that's also pure Eddie. So
it is. It's a very personal sort of reversal. So you mentioned earlier how Ed likes to talk about the frilly finery, and yes, Shirley, as she's often depicted, this is something that has become increasingly. I've become increasingly aware of recently, reading more and more Ed's texts, that when he gets into that moment where he's writing and he starts to talk about the frilly finery and about somebody wearing angora and wearing tight skirts and stuff like that, his prose starts to actually sing with a very different melodic cadence. He's enwrapped at that point when he's writing about things like that. So in this particular case, it's kind of interesting that Laura decides, I'm going to go out and do exactly the opposite. I'm going to dress down and I'm going to put on some flannel granny pajamas so my body is formless and it won't be attractive to Eddie Traynor.
Now, this is the ultimate self-punishment in an Ed Wood story.
Right.
In the book, A Drag Trade, one of the very frequent punishments for the characters is drag trade is about people who dress in drag and also commit crimes and how those intersect. And a lot of their stories end with them going to prison. And the worst part of being in prison, of course, is that they can't dress in drag and they have to wear the coarse clothes and they have to wear, prison jumpsuits and things like that. And Ed is very focused on how this clothing feels against your body.
Yeah.
And he really goes into detail into, Laura, how she feels when she's wearing these clothes that she has to buy from some sort of special granny store, which I don't know where that might be in Los Angeles. Well, not in New York, I guess, New York City.
Right.
And he's very focused on that, how the clothing feels against her body.
It feels quote unquote very rough, which is also the manner in which he describes the way men treat women. So there's the analogy of rough, both clothing as well as sexual treatment. And the corollary to that is the fluff. You said it yourself that sometimes the fluff is actually descriptive of the finery. So there's that, which in this particular story, she describes as quote unquote being treated with tenderly and lovingly, tender and loving, which is the complete opposite of the rough treatment. So she does actually address how awful this experience is for her by saying explicitly, but I know it won't be forever, and it's because it will free me of my relationship with Eddie Traynor, and being up against him is even worse than wearing these clothes.
It's the lesser of two evils.
Yeah.
Sometimes you gotta sacrifice. You have to rob Peter to pay Paul sometimes, and but you mentioned how loving the descriptions of the clothing is, and then I think that's what Ed is always waiting to get to when he starts these stories. He's like, plot, dialogue, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now the outfit. Now this is where I'm typing up. Now this is where I'm really getting into this story. Like what specifically is she wearing? And we get some of before she puts her plan into action, I guess we get some descriptions of her clothing, and we get frilly and sheer nighties. Yes. And nighties is, oh my gosh, is that word important to Ed? Nighties, not nightgown, although he'll use that term, but nighties. He loves nighties. Right. And sheer, I don't know why that's so important to him, but that goes back with Eddie, is the sheer thing.
I think when he's fingering the nightgown and on the counter in Glen or Glenda, that's exactly when the counter person looks. Yeah, very sheer. That's exactly when the counter person looks at him like there's something seriously wrong with you, right?
Yes.
So
she might be an old bull dyke herself. The
right,
lady.
Right. Good catch. So so now we're getting a little deeper into the story, and she's engaged in her plot, and it's working. It's working like a charm, right? She also goes one step further and stops styling her hair, lets it grow out, and then it's described as her hair now is very stringy and long. So she's really trying to make herself look unattractive. And as Joe said earlier, eventually the argument ensues where Eddie says, "You look like a garbage pail," and that argument is the argument that's pushes apart the relationship. And that was the last argument they ever had, and they immediately got divorced.
The first, I think it was like,
I know,
they had like one very brief and seemingly very polite argument, and like that was the thing that broke up your marriage.
Right. Now, going back a little bit, it's interesting to note that Laura does have sex with Eddie, and she despises it, obviously. She mentions at one point, she mentions two things that are worth noting. Number one, sometimes when we were having quote unquote lesbian sex, which I presume what he means is that Eddie is performing oral sex on her, she could envision that it was Marcia or Thelma or Jeannie, these girls from the city that she's become involved in, and she's cool, replacing Eddie in her mind. And then she mentions that sometimes she despised the sex a great deal, but he still brings her to climax, and only in the aftermath of the climax is she able to bring herself to kiss him, because she's still feeling the sort of, I guess, oceanic feeling in the aftermath of the climax. It's odd, right?
They have a complicated relationship.
Right.
As it happens this week, the issue of whether manly men can go down on women and still remain themselves was kind of in the cultural zeitgeist this week, because of, I don't know if you've seen it, but the story about Batman.
No, I did not.
There's been a controversy on social media of they do more adult Batman stories now in comics and in animation, and there was some controversy over whether or not Batman could perform oral sex on Catwoman. And they have had regular, like, missionary style sex in other comics, apparently. There was a controversy when Bruce Wayne was actually depicted nude in one of the comics. So apparently DC was like, no, you can't have Batman do this.
Interesting.
They said heroes don't do this. And so then this provoked this wave of ridicule and backlash, and like, what are you talking about? Batman should be able to go down on Catwoman if that's their relationship. And heroes definitely should do that. So
I agree.
But I guess Eddie Traynor was from that generation where it would be considered odd to do it, or I don't know, but
he's not disparaged at that
no
moment.
he doesn't at all. So he goes through with it.
Right.
Before we move on, there's one other issue in the story that's kind of happening in the background that is central to a lot of Eddie's stories, and that's the city to country and country to city transition. He loves to have stories about characters moving from the country into the city. Right. And poor Laura, she starts in the country, she moves out to the city. I believe she moves back to the country to marry Eddie Traynor because he's the hometown boy. And then when she's with him, she goes back to the city. So Eddie loves that, what I call it, the city mouse, country mouse dichotomy. And maybe he thought of himself that way, having moved from Poughkeepsie to Los Angeles. He was going from like a smaller town. I don't know how big is Poughkeepsie?
Not that big. It actually struck me, mentioning early on, Laura's 21 years old now, about the age Ed was when he came back from the war, and he spent a little bit of time in Poughkeepsie. And it made me wonder, are there autobiographical elements here that we don't actually know about?
That was what I was thinking because he comes back to this theme so many times in his stories of characters who come from the smaller towns or come from the country and move usually it's moving to Los Angeles. In this case, this is a story about moving to New York. But Laura kind of ping pong balls back and forth between the country and the city, and she eventually winds up back in the city. We haven't gotten to there yet, but how she winds up back in the city. But you know, oftentimes it's like the innocent, you know, the young, naive, innocent person is taken to the city, and they're like corrupted right away. I think there was, I've forgotten the name of the story. It's like something about the fog, where there's like some country kid who gets off the bus, and you know, within hours he's robbed and he's broke and he's on the street corner and all this stuff. But here, the city is where Laura can be herself. Laura can be her full self in the city in a way she can't be out in the suburbs. So the city country thing is a big theme for Eddie, and he brings it back up here. And that's another way that I would have known of this being one of Eddie's stories, because it's just one of his pet themes. So we're back into the story of Laura has put her plan into action. She's wearing the unappealing, unsexual, asexual clothing, and she's not combing her hair. And I guess this has led to a divorce.
Mm-hmm. Which she describes, and she says at that moment, and I was successful in painting a picture of him as a quote unquote cad.
Yeah, I wondered about that too.
Makes her look very unsympathetic. What did Eddie Trainer really do other than be a horny guy? I don't really know, right?
So yeah, he was the worst kind of cad, which another phrase from a bygone era, the worst kind of cad. But she apparently hired some, I would say, unscrupulous lawyer who, you know, painted this false picture of poor Eddie Trainer, who just never knew what hit him.
Or knowing Laura manipulated somebody into representing her.
Right. Oh, well,
that's not in the story, by the way. That's just
no.
If you do ultimately read the story, you'll see why we could speculate that Laura's capable of doing manipulative things like that.
Yeah, and you know, I guess she gets half of or I don't know, more, I don't know, of Eddie's money. And like I said, you know, she as soon as she gets that money, she wants to go right back out to the city. And it strikes me that her friends, Marcia, Jeannie, and Thelma, you mentioned them earlier, I don't think they're differentiated in any way. There's one that's supposed to be older, but we don't find out which one that is.
Right. We don't.
So it's just the oldest one of them, but they're just kind of like, you know, Huey, Dewey, and Louie of the lesbian world.
Yep.
And so I guess she gets back together with them and is drinking and partying, and but there's a twist.
There's a twist, and she is very happy, obviously, at this point. Let me just give a quick comment. The city country. Yes, very much so, right? And it even is reminiscent. It was a theme. It's a common theme in literature and film, etc. It makes me think F.W. Murnau's Sunrise, for instance. You know, classic silent film. The young couple who are very innocent go to the city and they're corrupted by the city. Ed's version of the city is exactly the opposite. The city is the place of freedom and getting away from the quote unquote puritanical slobs, which is the way.
Yeah, puritanical
slobs are the way that people where Laura grows up are described early on in the story. But yeah, so now Laura's free of Eddie and she's partying and hanging out with her crew in New York City, and she's very happy at this point. She's speculating. It's sort of almost like a coming out ball for her in some strange way. It's not described as such, but that's the feeling that you get. And they're so glad that she's there. And she speculates in her mind at some point. She's like, by the end of tonight, maybe I'll be with at least 2 of these girls, maybe all 3. Maybe all 3.
Who knows?
And it doesn't work out that way, which is where, let's incorporate, Joe, if you want to take us there real quick, the title. So how does the title come into play regarding that?
Well, you know, when people get the last laugh, it's usually because they have their ultimate revenge, you know, revenge being just best served cold. And even though I don't know that Eddie was trying to get any kind of revenge, on Laura. Maybe he did after that trial.
Right.
Eddie does eventually get his revenge on Laura.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we reveal what the? Yeah. Okay.
Sure.
Well,
spoiler alert, of course.
Spoiler alert for
the likelihood of you reading this until if it does come out in
for
edition.
a 50-year-old story.
Yeah.
You had 50 years to read it, so it's your fault.
Right.
Well, you know, all those shapeless clothes Laura had been wearing all that time was covering up her figure, even to herself.
Yes, astonishing.
And she did not realize that her own physique was undergoing a change. She just thinks that she was well fed, but it's more than that. She was married to Eddie for 6 months, and it looks like she's not going to be able to enjoy herself for another 3. So I
do the
guess
math, everybody. Do the
6
math.
and 3,
That's 9.
and then
9,
ultimately, I guess this is considered Eddie's long-term revenge on Laura. Which I don't know how that works. Like, what's he gonna say? Like, yeah, you know, like.
You're right. Eddie could not have planned this if he tried. He got her pregnant 6 months earlier. He's having sex with his wife. It wasn't, and even if he was okay with the notion of that, because we do get into that, Joe. She says to Marcia and Jeannie and Thelma, I make sure he wears quote unquote rubbers, and I can't be pregnant. There's just no way it could be happening. And then we get an immediate line after that from Laura's perspective, but I never said that. I never really did that. So she was practicing unsafe sex with Eddie. But again, they're married. So was he trying to impregnate her to get the last laugh ultimately? He could not have known at that point how things were going to transpire.
And you know what? She doesn't even seem that bummed at the end of the story. Like, she's like, oh, well.
She laughs too. She goes, well, I had to laugh one more time. So in many ways, the last laugh is actually her laugh, laughing along with her sort of comeuppance, because now the thing that she, you know, talked about despising early on in the story, this notion of domesticity and raising kids, now it's real, and now it's going to happen. And even worse, the three girls, Marcia, Jeannie, and Thelma, basically are like, once they realize she's pregnant, that very night at her coming out ball, they're like, we're out, sayonara. And so she doesn't, out with
some pregnant lady.
So she doesn't get her sexual fulfillment either. But she laughs earlier in the story when she starts to look in the mirror and see herself going to hell and seeing herself starting to look really, really unappealing. That's when she starts to look in the mirror. Is there a little bit of a weird Snow White thing going on there?
Could be. I think fairy tale archetypes did have an effect on Eddie's writing, but I think they have effect on so many people's writing. I think they worm their way into the narrative.
It would be the opposite. It would be not who's the fairest on the wall, but look how awful I look, and Eddie's not going to ever want to, fuck me again, right?
Well, now I have to wonder about this poor kid who is now gestating in the womb of Laura. First off, the kid's going to be born with like fetal alcohol syndrome, like you couldn't believe. And then, like, what is she going to be like? Is she going to raise this? She's going to raise this kid or something? Like, I don't think so. I don't know. And is Eddie going to be involved somehow? What I was thinking of was the John Waters movie, Female Trouble, where Divine runs away from home and gets pregnant right away. And she is the worst mother in cinematic history. She is the absolute worst mother who ever has lived. And she has a couple of coded as lesbian friends that form her little peer group, Chicklet and Concetta. And she becomes just a horribly abusive mother to her daughter, Taffy, and won't let Taffy go to school, and won't let Taffy have friends or toys. And then ultimately their relationship goes in a horrible direction. And I was thinking, like, and that's all played for laughs in the movie.
Right. And it's funny. That's actually my favorite John Waters movie, by the way.
And if we want to bring it back to Ed, you know, one of the cast members of Female Trouble is Connie Brooks's brother.
Henry
Badersky is in it.
Yeah.
So, but I was just thinking like, oh, she's going to become like, she's going to become another Dawn Davenport as a mom. She's going to be a horrible mom to this kid.
Right.
So I was like, boy, I would almost out of morbid curiosity want like the update, like 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, what is happening to this kid? Because I think Laura, once she gives birth, is going to go back to partying as hard as she possibly can. She's still a young woman. She's still like
21 or 2 years
21
old.
or 2 years old. So
right.
She's still going to party as hard as she can.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's her plan. I would guess.
Yeah, right.
Which is what Dawn does as well. I mean, Dawn sees getting pregnant as kind of like, you know, an inconvenience to her. You know, her wild, crazy, crime-filled lifestyle. You know, oh, now I have this freaking baby that I have to take care of, and that's what I think is going to happen to this poor kid. So, obviously a title like Last Laugh, it makes it sound very definite and final, but I think there will be some tears shed after this, unless she gives the kid up for adoption or something.
Right.
But,
it would be fascinating to know what ultimately becomes of the kid. We'll never know.
But I guess people can write fan fiction. You can write The Last Laugh too if you're out there.
That's true. If anybody wants to take that on, we'd be interested in reading that. Well, I think. Yeah.
You know, I don't think it's possible to people try to write like Eddie. I don't think it's possible to write like Eddie. So my one bit of Ed Wood fan fiction, I didn't try to write like Eddie at all. I just tried to write like me and just used Eddie's characters. And that's, if you want to go looking for that, that's an article in the Ed Wood Wednesdays series, I think called The Secret Testimony of Miserable Souls. And I learned pretty quickly, you can't write like Eddie. People try and do it for movies, like they'll try to write like in the style of Eddie, and they can't do it at all. I guess one example of maybe more successful attempt at writing like Eddie is in the movie Ed Wood, the play that we see in the movie The Casual Company. That's not Ed at all. That's none of that we see in the movie is Ed, or even close to what Casual Company is about or what it's like.
Right.
That's Scott Alexander and Larry Karaszewski writing in the style of Ed, and I would say they
capture it pretty well. It's got that stilted feeling to it, right?
Yeah, I would say they come pretty close. But here, look, you got Eddie's favorite adjective in the world must be lovely, because he uses it 4 times. And he loves to use it in all his movies. He likes to use it in his stories, his novels. He throws in the ellipses. He throws in the italics. You know, you gotta work those things in, but you gotta try to make it seem like you're not trying to work those in. Another thing that's in this story that's very Eddie is, for some reason in his writing, and I guess you sometimes get it in his movies, is he's very focused on people's body temperatures, on people feeling hot flashes and cold chills, and the heat rushes through their body at certain moments and cold chills. So we get cold chills and hot flashes in this story.
Boiling. How about when people are quote unquote boiling?
Boiling.
Yeah.
So that must have been something that Eddie himself experienced, you know, that when he would get very excited over something, or very maybe sexually aroused, maybe he felt like really getting hot. And then if he was scared or nervous about something, he would feel a cold chill. So maybe like his body temperatures were going up and down a lot.
Fascinating.
Because his characters were always doing that. And now when I watch some of the films like Orgy of the Dead, you know, like when they go into the cemetery and Bob says, you know, I felt a cold chill all over. And I was like, oh, that's so Eddie, you know. So if you're trying to write like Eddie, that was, but the things that you can't get are just his philosophy. Like Eddie Traynor doesn't have to work, for instance. Eddie doesn't have to work, but he does anyway because the human being was meant to work, is what it says in the story. And it's just like in Glen or Glenda, too bad we was born to work. I was like, that's Eddie. That's Eddie's thinking.
And Laura finds that idea, of course, repugnant, right?
Yeah,
she may
right.
even, she uses that word that he's repugnant, but she finds that idea equally repugnant.
What a dummy, having to work.
Exactly. Now, this is interesting. Or very early on here, Joe, in the podcast, you had mentioned that in his all male fiction, his gay fiction, he often writes disparagingly of male homosexuals, and he does. He brings up a lot of stereotypes at times that are, in today's world, very, very not only anachronistic, but quite frankly, they're pitiful. And at the same time, though, a counter viewpoint momentarily.
Sure.
The especially in the pictorial texts, and I've read now probably about, let me do a quick math, maybe 100 or so pictorial texts accompanying photo features in the all-male magazines. I've read a lot of this stuff. And very often in those pictorial texts, there's a couple things that happen, which is where when the guys start to click and have a genuine relationship, very, very sexual relationships, obviously, but they decide to go get jobs so that they can pay their rent, so they can be together. And there's an element of domesticity to it that's different and very divorced from what we're talking about in this particular story. And then we talked about, yes, using the word lovely, talking about people being tender and loving. There's no love whatsoever in this story. And generally speaking, it made me think about how there's very little love in Ed Wood's fiction generally, except for in those all male pictorial texts, which I find fascinating. Again, my viewpoint, but
that's why you have to cherish in Ed's stories any relationship where there is sweetness or tenderness in them, and we get them very occasionally, but they stand out. Things like Rocky and Angie in the Watts books, or Glenn and Barbara in Glen or Glenda. You have to find these few relationships where there is tenderness. Generally, I think he sees marriage as like this big battlefield, and the characters are always sniping at each other and things like that. And Laura is a very calculating, cold-blooded character. If there's any love that she has, it's maybe affection for her trio of lesbian friends, maybe a little bit, but Marcia, Jeannie, and Thelma, they're not even differentiated as individuals. So I kind
of didn't take it as necessarily them even possessing any affection for her, but her being so narcissistic and self-centered that she was satisfied by them just treating her in a manner that made her feel good about herself. In other words, treating her, quote unquote, like the fluff that she feels herself to be. So connection point. That's a great point. And just overall, this is again 3 pages within a magazine, and this vast body of work that Ed Wood wrote. But in those 3 pages, there's no love lost. There's very little connection points genuinely between people. They connect to sex acts. They connect to externalities of not even necessarily sex, but just what you're wearing and things of that nature. There's it's interesting. He doesn't go there. Rarely, to your point, Angie and Rocky are a great example where they seem to have a relationship that actually clicks and there is a connection. But the connections, and this is again my opinion, hard to find. You cited a handful of instances where it's very evident, but it's more commonplace that it is like Rick and Renee and Necromania sniping at each other
all the time.
Yeah.
And life is very short, and there's no time for fussing and fighting, my friends, as it says in the song. And I have to wonder about Eddie's own. It makes you think. We weren't there, but you have to wonder what his marriage to Kathy was like. Is they're always fighting? In the stories that people tell about them, they're always fighting, if not just in words, but sometimes physically.
Yeah.
And that was one thing that where we dodged a bullet with this story, was that we have established that Eddie Traynor is a masculine, manly man, and he is being done dirty by his wife. And one thing that I think, if Ed were in a worse mood when he wrote this story, the thing that he would have had Eddie do,
right,
and he has done this in other stories, is have her like smack her across the face and hit her, and
or murder her.
Murder her.
Or
Yeah,
her.
he'll have dissatisfied husbands just outright murder their wives. So I think this story might have caught Eddie in maybe a better mood, because the fact that he doesn't turn Eddie Traynor into a violent monster when he could have, that would have been, I mean, there are some ugly stories that Eddie has written when he's maybe at his worst.
Right.
And he lets the bile, rise to the surface and spew onto his typewriter. And
you're right. He doesn't. Go ahead.
No, I was just glad that we didn't get that in Last Laugh.
We didn't. Yeah, we didn't. So we got a very bleak portrait of domesticity, a bleak portrait of relationships, a bleak portrait of human nature generally. But yeah, we don't get that sort of violent denouement where it's just really awful, and no one gets assaulted, right? Which
nothing like
is
that.
Commonplace, right? Not at all.
Well, yeah, in if you read Blood Splatters Quickly and Angora Fever, I don't know if these especially violent and horror-based stories are maybe inordinately represented, but a lot of the stories in those are very, very violent. And I think the reason why they are selected to be in the anthologies, because Bob doesn't run everything that he has. Bob has stuff that he doesn't run. Is that they're often the more action and action oriented and entertaining stories, right, and the most like a movie. And so people who buy Blood Splatters Quickly or Angora Fever, and they're looking for that Ed Wood movie experience, but in book form, all these stories, like Blood Splatters Quickly, which is one of the actual stories. That would give them what they're looking for. Mm-hmm. And they may, I don't know if anybody would feel ripped off or let down by Last Laugh, because it is, it doesn't go to full on insanity. I think probably the most Woodian thing about this story, and if people want that crazy Eddie stuff, the twist, I think, is probably what they're going to come away with most of all. The idea that Laura could have been so unaware of her own body because she's wearing these clothes. Yeah. And you really have to, it's one of those things where you just really have to, buy into it. You really just have to say, like, well, I'm going on this ride with you, Eddie, and sure, why not? That could, sure. Well, there was that reality series, like I Didn't Know I Was Pregnant. I think that was a reality series a few years ago. So I guess it happens, but the way that it happens here, I think, is
it's a stretch.
It stretches, it stretches almost to the point of breaking reality. But right. It's kind of what you're hoping. It's more of what you're hoping for from Eddie, because I think when people get into his literature, they want the crazy. Let's face it, they want the crazy. They want the outlandish plot twists. They want stuff like that. So I don't know if this is the kind of story that Bob would have included in one of those anthologies. It would have. I think in one of those anthologies, it would have tended to blend in. Right. I think I reviewed like I think the first one has like 30 stories, and then the second one has like 60 stories. And believe me, after you review like a few dozen of them day by day by day, they do all start to mesh together into one big blob. And I can't say for sure that Last Laugh is one that would have stuck in my mind.
Right. So yeah, in terms of evaluating, I agree with a couple of quick comments. Definitely in the first two volumes of short stories, I think they're definitely, and it's not a bad thing per se, but there's a bias towards his more pulpy, sort of action-oriented, violent material, as opposed to his real murky sexual material. One thing we didn't note here, he doesn't. We've noted in previous paperback reviews that he seems at times more inebriated than others, and it's evident in the writing. He doesn't seem all that crazy here.
No, not here.
Not at all. We also neglected to mention that when she goes out for her night on the town after finally ditching Eddie, we do get a mention of Angora, so that's important to mention.
Yeah.
She's wearing white Angora, and only mention of Angora in the book, but that's signatory, obviously. There's no doubt about that. But I felt the first time I read it, I felt like she's unsympathetic. We get a very superficial portrayal of Eddie, and he's being knocked by her, which only makes her look more unsympathetic. And what has he really done? And then she goes through her machination, and then we get this sting in the tail. And the sting in the tail, you do have to really stretch credibility there, Joe. You really do, to believe that.
It is,
and yeah, you're right. It has happened, certainly, but it seems challenging to think, unless somebody perhaps had some really psychological problems. I'm not a psychologist, so don't quote me on it, but how would you not know 6 months into your pregnancy that you're pregnant? Your body is undergoing a vast change, and another human being has grown fairly large inside of you.
So, but that in the pantheon of Ed Wood short story twists, it's nowhere near like the craziest or most contrived. Like Eddie can go way crazier than this. Like Breasts of the Chicken is
great.
Not see
great story.
That's Eddie at like a full crazy. That's Eddie as like letting the imagination totally run wild. And there was another one about launching lesbians into space, and how that was going to be the start of a new civilization. And I was like, okay, there you go. That's the kind of like so far over the top that you couldn't even see the top anymore. It's so far beneath you or behind you that you couldn't even find it if you wanted to. You're so far away from it. This is just like, I'm not even sure that like if you were a connoisseur or a regular reader of men's magazines or dirty magazines from the 70s, if you'd stopped and might as well read. Did you even read it? But heck, well, we haven't said this in a while, but compared to Playboy, these magazines are not cheap. They are kind of like, you're paying a few bucks a piece for them, and they're not cheap. Like compared to like you can get a Playboy at this time for way cheaper than what Burning was selling stuff for.
You're in a different market, and you're paying for harder material. Can we take a pause, everybody? I just want to take a quick break so Joe and I can collect our thoughts. So we've gone pretty deep into the story. Now we're going to start to work our way out of it. We'll be back momentarily.
All right.
Thank you, everybody. Just a little quick pause there so we could stretch our limbs. So now, Joe, we're at the point where we've talked about the short story and pretty much taken everybody through the narrative. And I think we've also given people a sense of our evaluation of the short story. Yeah, I was generally, I don't want to say I found it disappointing. I find it interesting because Ed wrote it and it has so many of his hallmarks embedded in it, but it really didn't jump at me as one of those stories. You mentioned Breasts of the Chicken, which is actually a short story I've absolutely adore. And
Yeah,
it is indeed an absolutely crazy story. I've actually thought about that would make a great short film.
yeah.
Mm.
And this is not like that. This is not one that I think people would remember that much. It uses a lot of the same terminology as Eddie's other stories. It would blend right in to either one of those short story anthologies, but that might be the problem. There are ones where the devil is in them, and then there's backwards messages in them, and Dracula is in at least one or two of them, and there's murders and decapitations and killer dentists. There's at least two, I think, killer dentists in these stories. And when you get to something like The Last Laugh, or just Last Laugh, I don't think the word "the" is even in the title. Right. It's boilerplate Eddie. It is just it's standard Eddie. Again, it has a funny twist, but is it funny enough that you're going to remember it after Breast of the Chicken, or there's even one that if you want to read there's even a short story where if you want to read another one where the dead are rising up from a cemetery, he has stuff like that. That would very much fit in with Plan 9. Lots of cemetery stories, some mad scientist stories, things like that. No, if you were to come across this, no, I don't think it would make that big an impression. The thing that I enjoyed about it was that there's certain idiosyncrasies to Eddie's writing, and there's a certain cadence to it that is hard to replicate and hard to duplicate.
Yeah.
And reading a thing like Last Laugh gets you into it. It's just like it's your millionth McDonald's hamburger, but exactly, there's no hamburger exactly like a McDonald's hamburger. They're very, very distinctive. Not that maybe the best hamburger you've ever had. I hope you've had better hamburgers than what they can serve at McDonald's. But the exact texture of that is something that no other place can really give you. Yeah. So that's what you get from Last Laugh. You get this is Mick Eddy. This is 1 million served. It's very, very typical of his style. Maybe too typical. But I find it comforting. I don't know why it is. And when we've gone through the novels, there's a certain style that Eddie has of writing and a certain way he has of formulating dialogue in a very stilted way, and where it seems like one generation removed from what people would actually say, like it was translated from another language and into English or something. That's something that it says in the documentary A Look Back in Angora. His scripts read like they were translated from some other language. And so that, like, no guy wants to make it with a garbage pail and stuff like that. I mean, you only get that from Eddie. So what I would say is that it gives you that fix. It gives you it's a brief fix. It's like, doing poppers or something, it just gives you a couple of minutes of fun here. But that's why I would say it's, I don't know, it's worth tracking down. I don't know, because I don't know. Right. That's maybe a stretch.
I think, in fact, you would have a really hard time actually tracking it down. I mean, Bob obviously watches the eBay listings very rigorously and looks for opportunities and goes for all these things. Yes, with eBay not going to sell. eBay's not going to sell adult material soon.
This is something that's happening, and it's happening not just on eBay, but it's happening everywhere. So many internet platforms, they are terrified of sex. They don't want to be associated with anything sexual. So everybody's cracking down. and so searching for things about adult films and things, that it's getting more and more difficult because no search engine wants to send you to that stuff anymore. Every platform is getting very, very skittish, and eBay is getting skittish. Facebook is infamously skittish. YouTube, right. Twitter, all these places are getting terrified of everything, and the search engines like Google and Yahoo, they're getting. I have to say that Yahoo used to be like, they didn't give a F. They DGAF, man. They would send you to anything.
Wild Wild West, right?
It was, and somebody must have told them, like, hey, like Yahoo, you're linking to some really salacious stuff. So you got to cool it. And so now if you search any term on Yahoo, you get the same kind of very clean results that you would get on any search engine. So
it makes no sense, right? It makes no rational sense in today's world. It maybe made sense 25 years ago, 30 years ago during the PC era, but now there's so much material and content freely available to you online that to try to shut down a segment of retail merchandising of old sex material. It makes absolutely no sense. It would be interesting if people, sites like Pornhub or X-Hamster, these massive conglomerates, streaming porn sites, if maybe they took on the retail merchandising. Somebody's gonna come along to fill that void inevitably, because there's a huge industry and there's a lot of money to be made.
That's exactly where it's gonna go. It's gonna have to, like Pornhub or X-Hamster, they're going to have to take that over, because Amazon, I think, is probably going to be getting very skittish about these things. And it broke my heart. Tumblr became very, very strict in what you could and could not post, because I had to censor the holy heck out of Edward Wednesday's and on the Edward Wednesday's Tumblr. And I think the Dead to Rights is on a Google-owned platform,
right?
Yeah. So I think that's a Google-owned thing, and their crackdown was a few years ago. So I had to censor the holy hell out of the blog, and then I had to censor the holy hell out of the Tumblr.
Yeah.
And
I think a couple of the tumblers actually bit the dust during that time frame.
Yeah, a couple of the articles had to, I think, what would happen is they would take the article and they would put it in this, like, from my perspective as the Tumblr owner, they would put it in this like red stop sign folder. I would say, like, they would say, you have to review this thing, and this thing, and before we can put it back up. And on some of them, I just said, well,
they can't be fixed, right? They just can't be fixed.
Some of them can't be fixed, so some of them are going to have to go. Some of them I just censored, and some of them I just said, well, sorry, you're gonna have to go. And it was like watching Arnold Schwarzenegger as the Terminator, as he kind of like sticks his hand up and he's like being melted, and like the hand goes down, and like the last thing you see are the fingers. And that was what it was like watching those posts die. And there was posts at the blog that I also had to just take completely down. So
which, in 2021, it's rather astonishing.
Well, what would happen?
I have a very liberal sensibility, clearly, so I see it probably differently than most people.
The thing that would happen is that they would put warnings and stuff on the blog, and then like people would say, "Oh, I can't read your blog at all because there's like there's a warning in front of it." So I was like, "Well, I can't have that." So I just had to censor. I just had to censor everything. And I've tried to have ads on the blog, and that's always a laugh. because they're like, it usually lasts about a day and then they say no. And then they'll find like something from 5 years ago or something. But it's difficult to write about this stuff and not be a little bit dirty.
Yeah.
Probably to illustrate this particular episode of the Ed Wood Summit podcast, I'm going to use some artwork from the story, and for that, I had to go into Photoshop and clean it up just a little,
I'm
just
intrigued.
a little bit. I had to clean it up just a bit because even though it's a drawing, I mean, it's not like it's even a person. It's just a drawing.
I was wondering what you were gonna. Okay, so I know where you're going with this. I'm intrigued.
It's a drawing of a lady in a frilly sheer see-through nightgown. I thought, well, we got to have that because that's what the story is about. And I was like, I don't know. Like, you never know what they're going to send you. A content warning on that. You never know what they're going to send you. A little snippy. I'm sure machine generated.
Sure.
Thing. It's not like there's some. I don't think there's some guy who's going through all my articles and reading every single thing. I'm sure they have software that's designed to detect a breast or something.
Yes, there's a gentleman whose job actually is to review all the posts at Ed Wood Wednesdays and at the Ed Wood Summit podcast.
I hope that guy is well paid. I hope that guy is well paid. But yeah, we're Eddie would warn about this, the new Puritanism, the new puritanical times. So enjoy this. Well, I think the thing is that people took the freedom and they abused it. They used it to post stuff that is not legal, immoral, abusive, all kinds of absolutely horrendous stuff that people would post. And now at X Hamster, you can't even publish photo galleries. That was because that used to be something you used to send me for articles.
Yeah.
You'd like send me like whole passels of photographs.
That's awful.
And I would be like, well, what the hell can I do with this? I can't
I didn't know that.
I can't publish that picture. I can't publish that. I'm gonna have to crop that to where it's just her from the nostrils up. I think 2 nights ago, they were rerunning the Ed Sullivan Show with Elvis Presley. And this was the where they had to film him from the shoulders up. And I'm like, I'm right there with you, Ed. I know what they had to, film him like this because they couldn't show his, pelvis swinging around and all the stuff. They couldn't show it. So you have to see, Elvis just from where we are, in this Zoom call. And I was like, well, I have to do that with practically a lot of the stuff that you send me. I have to be like,
sorry.
There. Well, that's just the nature of, it's just the nature of having to do this stuff. But the stuff that they were freaking out about, I was like, oh my God, it was like the boxes. It was like not one of the, how the reels, the loop reels would come in sort of generic boxes. So there would be loop series that would come in like standard boxes. That was the thing that they freaked out about. Like there was one that had like a cartoon of a lady or something on it.
It's bizarre. It's bizarre. Actually, it makes me think, yes, in this view that we have here currently, we could be Jeffrey Tubening right now, and you would not know it, right?
You wouldn't know.
So, I'm being a little facetious because the whole thing really, I find it
silly, but
I find it silly, but I also want to be respectful to people's viewpoints. At the same time, maintain the notion of free speech. This is very murky. This has been murky since Ed's day, right? And it becomes murky at different times as the culture transforms, because we've gone through a period now of probably, I'm again not a sociologist, but maybe the last 15, 20 years, we've gone through a period where there was a great deal of freedom, but now we see signs as we move
Pulling
forward
back.
that we're
Pulling
going
back.
backward a little bit. So maybe it is.
I got to get
steps
involved with the
forward.
mafia. I got to get involved with the mafia. That's what's going to happen. I'm going to have to, I don't know, Michael Thieves Jr. or the third or whomever.
Well, I know a guy, Joe, who was friends with Michael Thieves Jr. when he was in high school, and went to Michael Thieves' house. And
find that dude.
Michael Thieves, and he really liked biking, like motocross biking. So his son, Michael Thieves Jr., and this friend of his from high school, and name names obviously, he told me, I used to go over to his house, and I knew his dad was something, to a rich guy and involved in, strange things. But really, it was all about, he had all these motocross bikes, and we used to go biking all the time, and it was a lot of fun. So they're people, by the way. These are all people, just
They're
like me
people,
and you,
yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Right?
it's the hardworking men and women. That's the one weird thing that's come up, is that I said the hardworking men and women of the porn industry, is that now it is really like super politically correct to be supportive of sex workers, which is good. I'm glad. That's one thing where you can be like, you can be super supportive of strippers and sex workers, as strippers or prostitutes or actresses or actors in porn. So, there's all these slogans like sex work is work, and that goes around Twitter a lot. So, of course, we still are judgmental of the people consuming the porn. We still are like, the guy reading the porn is a creepy scumbag, but the people people producing the porn,
I'm guilty.
The people producing the porn are to be protected. So
right.
I don't know. It's another weird double standard. But hopefully, while we still can get this 50 and 60-year-old material out there into the world.
For sure.
And I hope, for God's sakes, Bob, just if you're out there listening, and I'm sure you are eventually, just buy. Just buy all that stuff as soon as you can. Because
I think on that subject, I think Bob's one man, and he's done a heroic job. But again, I've talked to a handful of other guys who have collected an enormous amount of Ed Wood magazines that contain Ed Wood's work, going long back before Bob even started collecting, long before I really started to dig really deep into this about 6 years ago or so. So we're talking about going back to, the aughts, the 20 aughts, when apparently, and I was not a part of it, there was a big Yahoo Facebook group devoted to Ed Wood, and there were some really, really interesting, and I've started to meet some of these people and correspond with them over time who still are interested in Ed Wood, and we're like, there was a really active group at the time that was really digging deep into the magazine work. So a lot of this stuff fortunately has been collected, but it's disparate, and different people have it, because if we're talking about 700 Pendulum /Calga /Edgesex SECS Press, Gallery Press, Swedish erotica magazines or more, we're talking about an immense amount of work that it would be almost impossible, well, unless you had a ton of money, right? Unless you were super wealthy, to be able to collect that immense amount of work. So I've often had this thought: how can you somehow collate all that work together? How can you bring these people together? So I've been thinking about that recently, and actually trying to float some communications to people, some ideas about how we can start to bring that together. I myself, I bought a handful of Pendulum magazines here and there through the years, and I found scans, and I find myself actually lately buying more and more. It's addictive.
Well, I'm glad somebody's out there doing it. I have nothing. I'm a person who has literally nothing unless people share it with me, nothing unless people send it to me. And if people ever ask, why didn't you review such a movie, or why didn't you review such a book or article or something, it's just because I don't have it. So
right. Well, I'll share it with you, obviously, what I
Yeah,
have,
you
and you've
share
done the same.
like
That's interesting, Joe. This is part of the Ed Wood experience for me over the course of the last 5 or 6 years, has been one of the most warm and generous experiences of my adult life.
yeah.
I don't have friction. I don't have dramatic relationships. I don't have bad experiences with the people I meet who are passionate Ed Wood fans. I find them to be generally very generous. I find them to be really smart and interesting people.
Yeah, they're people have shared so much with me, and they've sent me so much stuff, and I'm really grateful now that Bob hit me to the Facebook group, because
Yeah.
it upped my game like 1,000%. You know, it was like going from having like a pen light or something, just having like a spotlight. You know, it
Right.
was like so much more stuff is out there that I would never have known about. Um, and people are always posting, there's posting pictures and posting film clips and things. And I'll be like, oh, I've never seen that one
I know,
before.
it's
Hey,
astonishing.
what is this thing over here?
Sometimes in the course of a couple of days or a couple of weeks or something like that, I'll see posts from other people. I'll be like, well, I it just never ends, right? It seems like it's like a faucet that somebody turned on somewhere, and there's just Ed Wood pouring out of this faucet. And if you can get close enough
Yeah.
to it, you can catch a few drops of what's coming
And
out of it. It's
and
astonishing
and
after all these years, especially.
Bob, God bless him, will occasionally post some incredible rarities. He's got some scripts
Oh
and all
yeah.
kinds of stuff that he posts. And so whenever I've been able to do screenplay reviews, those have come from Bob. Although the Plan 9 script that I'd wanted for years, I think that was,
It was published in book form a long time ago, right?
well, no, we talked about that. I talked about that in the article. The book is a transcript that
Okay.
was done after the fact. The actual screenplay has been circulating in like a very bad quality copy, but it was I think it was Angel Scott who posted a PDF of that to the group, and
I missed that. Oh my God, I missed that. I'm gonna
I
have
did
to
a
check that
whole
out.
article of, there's an Edward Wednesdays article where I review the script and compare it, the script to the movie, and
It's crazy I
I
missed that.
I wanted to see it for years, and yeah, it was only because of the Ed Wood group that I was able to do it. So
But it's just more and more material keeps turning up, right? As far as
yeah,
scripts go, I know that a gentleman told me about 6 months ago, hey, I used to sell it on eBay. I have a copy of the Double Noose script, right, the Double Noose script.
wow,
So I told him at the time, I'm like, dude, you were selling it on eBay? I'm like, well, I want to buy a copy now or trade you for a copy or whatever the hell you want to do. I want to get my hands on that. So we kind of lost touch a little bit, but I obviously need to reconnect with him because that's important. And
yeah,
then Paul Apel and I were here a few weeks. Paul Apel, by the way, a friend of mine, Paul Apel, he loves it. He says, wow, you mentioned me often on the Ed Wood Summit podcast. So I just did it again. So we were
good.
here on the Ed Wood Summit podcast a little while ago talking about
Talking about
the Frank
Frank
Leahy Legend
Legend,
screenplay, which is
see,
astonishing that turned up. And there's so much, I feel like there's so much more out there. I believe it's Peter Coe's son, Peter Nago, who has a script that Ed wrote that he found in his father's collection, which is
yeah,
a musical from near the end of Ed's life, which was largely unknown work, and he has a copy of it. How
wow.
much more material could there
Could there
potentially be
could
out there?
be?
It's astonishing.
It
It's
is a stunt.
mind-boggling. I
And
think.
then there's the occasional one that got away though, like Eddie adapted 3 of his short stories as scripts
Mm,
to do what I think has been described as the 3 ages of man.
yeah,
The young
yeah,
man, the middle-aged man, and the old man. And the short stories are well known. The short stories are out there. They're easy to
right.
find. But he was going to do it as an anthology film. The scripts were out there. They were sold on some auction site that was not eBay, bought by some unknown person for like a pittance. And
Where is it now? Right.
Where are they?
That's astonishing. I remember it was just recently that Joe mentioned that. I was like, holy shit, I had never heard of that. And that's incredible. Those are To Kill a Saturday Night. That's a great existential short story about drunks, right? Really fantastic.
And
what's the other? Mice on the Cold Cellar Floor.
Mice on a Cold Cellar Floor. Mice on the Cold Cellar Floor was the young man. The middle-aged man was To Kill a Saturday Night, and the old man was the Epitaph for the Village Drunk.
Right. After you posted that this screenplay existed, I read all three, and I'm like, that would be astonishing. I wish that turned up.
That would be really cool. But then there's just stuff that, you know, Bob just sent me a while ago, that Trial by Terror and things like that. Like that I was know. The jungle adventure story. Like,
exactly.
Who knew that
Trial
thing
by
existed?
Terror. And you sent me a copy of that. So this stuff, so everybody knows, surreptitiously, Ed Wood material gets passed around against us obsessives. It does, quite frankly. And I think Bob might appreciate this statement. We do a pretty good job of being respectful to not just like posting it absolutely everywhere. We try to keep it amongst ourselves. I think actually very much so, a great deal of sort of respect for nebulous copyright rights, which are, I don't want to even get into that notion. There's also, Joe, in the first Summit podcast, Mike H was with us here, and he has an original hand annotated copy of Night of the Ghouls, and he showed it to us, right? Wow. So there's, again, so much material out there that's astonishing. Yeah.
Well, then there's stuff that's just out there in the open and nobody knew it or cared about it. Like somebody emailed me a few weeks ago or a couple months ago about the Showdown, and the Showdown had been restored, like a print of the Showdown had been restored, and then it just been posted to YouTube, and nobody noticed or cared. And this guy said, hey, there's this Ed Wood scripted Western that's out there, and there it was. And I couldn't believe it. And so
well, check that article out Joe wrote about 3 weeks ago or so about the Showdown. It's on YouTube, and you'll find a link to it there. And Tom Keene is in that. And that was astonishing when you sent it to me. In fact, you sent that to me. You sent me a link to that on YouTube the same day I received via email the Frank Leahy Legend script. And like, how does a day like this happen after the gentleman Ed Wood has been dead since 1978, and we're still swirling. I was going to say swirling the drain. We're not swirling the drain. We're still circling around the light, right?
We don't even know how the Frank Leahy legend, how it was rediscovered, is kind of murky, because I said I remembered somebody. What happened was I remembered somebody posting somewhere that it was in some archive. So I was looking around at California archives of screenplays until I found one that had the Frank Leahy legend listed. And then I think 2 or 3 of us started corresponding with the librarian there until she finally
did you get a copy from the library directly?
No, you sent it to me.
Okay.
I think
I'm sure it was probably me saying, I didn't know, but if you started corresponding, so Paul Apel and I did, so there you go. Paul.
No, I was just asking.
I mentioned you again, Paul. I mentioned you again.
I was just asking her questions like, do you have it? Is it available?
Right.
Got it, and blah blah blah.
So I talked about it in that podcast, but her name was Jessica, and she was absolutely the angel on our shoulder. So Paul and I both made formal requests, and we sent numerous communications over the course of a couple of weeks before we finally got our hands on it. And then it was absolutely astonishing that we were able to get our hands on that. That story is not over, by the way, Joe. So the provenance of the Frank Leahy legend, Paul continues to dig quite deep into it. And I've continued. I think I became way more fascinated, fucking fascinated with Notre Dame football than I ever expected I would be.
Well, I wanted to know, how was it discovered in this archive in the first place? Who knew it was in this archive, and which archive it was? I just remembered Frank Leahy legend archive. and then search for it
Right.
that way.
So Loyola Marymount, super quick, because Paul and I are going to come back on a future summit,
Yeah.
and we've been talking about this recently about we need to close the loop on a lot of items that we've come across since last talking about it and breaking down the screenplay, as well as the book. I broke the book down one day, the Frank Leahy Legend book that the screenplay was based on, here on a Summit podcast, and so yeah, I'm a big Notre Dame fan these days. But Loyola Marymount University. So I presume it's listed. So if you did a Google search, you would find it in the online listings at Loyola Marymount in their archive. So I think that's possibly how somebody may have come across it. So the collection itself was bequeathed to Loyola Marymount by Blessed Sacrament Church. In sort of, I think, South Hollywood, going a little bit further south towards like Torrance. I'm, by the way, not from Southern California, and I've never been to Southern California.
I've been once.
I haven't, and I feel like I know the geography quite well from all this woodology. Yeah.
Well, I have to study a lot of these same places too, because not just for Ed Wood, but of course I do the weekly Happy Days podcast. I'm always trying to find filming locations, and of course it's all this in the same area.
Yeah.
Very soon, I'm going to have to write something about Ed Wood's supposed first real movie, first movie directing job, and the first shot of Ed Wood's supposed first movie is across the street from where Happy Days was filmed. So
astonishing. Yeah, you mentioned that to me, Joe. That's great.
So it's on Ed is walking by what was RKO Studios, I guess, at that time, and then the street is where Paramount is now, and it's absolutely like a lost world. When you look at Ed's footage from there, and I even found the bar that was in that first shot, and I found an astonishing help wanted ad for that bar that I want to write about. This some sort of cafe that was on wherever this was. It's like on Santa Monica Boulevard or something. Right. It was more maybe Melrose. It was like one of those streets, and this place was Paramount took over another whole block, and they just decimated. They just took over a whole block, and they'd been over here, and then they bought another whole block and just wiped it out, and put parking lots and stuff up on it. And so this bar from Ed Wood's first shot is gone because it's taken up by it was swallowed up by the Paramount lot. And
well, I can't wait for you to delve into that, because you're talking about Range Revenge. So Range Revenge, there's I've talked to a few people about this now, and there are a couple of people who feel that Crossroads of Laredo was actually Ed's first film work. I agree with you, Joe, that it's actually Range Revenge. The timeline's tight, and it's interesting, and it's a bit murky, but we'll sort it out slowly over time.
This is something that I don't know how I'm going to cover it. Maybe an article, maybe an episode of this. We could cover Range Revenge. Because I think you have it by now too. I think you have.
Well, you uploaded the footage from. It was put out by Cult Movies Magazine back in the 1990s on a VHS tape. And
it's the same one where I got the Hellborn footage.
Yeah, the Hellborn footage. That's how it was released, as the Hellborn footage. But Range Revenge was a great bonus, obviously.
And again, that was people. People hipping me to that were from the Facebook group. That's how I got that. That was people through the Facebook group. It's either Al Dashna or Phil Fry, and Phil sent me all kinds of crazy stuff, and I think Alice sent me stuff too. And no, I would never have found any of that stuff if it weren't for the Facebook group. I wouldn't have any of it. So God bless them.
Exactly. It's hard to believe, again, that this much material still survives. And it continues to turn up. More material continues to turn up, astonishingly enough. And there are these moments. There's been these moments over the course of the last 5 or 6 years of my life where like there's something that we're that close to, like Operation Red Light. Someday I'll tell the whole
Well,
story of Operation Red Light here, and I'll say I felt like I literally came home one night and I had an email from somebody and said, Operation Red Light has turned up and the footage is going to be given back to us. That's a long story and it didn't happen. So
no,
this makes your heart sink, right?
but then there's breakthroughs,
Oh yeah,
things like Take It Out and Trade, which is absolutely
incredible.
And that what we have now for Take It Out and Trade is this beautiful Blu-ray edition of Take It Out and Trade. It's absolutely astonishing that this exists. And so now is maybe one of the best times ever to be an Ed Wood fan. It's more stuff that you could ever. Of course, the real time to have been one would have been during the late 60s, early 70s, because you could have gone around to all the adult bookstores and just bought all this stuff up.
If you knew, right? If you knew, who would have known, right? Who would have known? No one.
Nobody
would have
knew
known at that point. Even though Ed signed his name to a lot of these short stories, it wasn't like a selling point. It's just going. Let's go back actually to Last Laugh. Now this is a good opportunity to segue back to Last Laugh and talk a little bit about the magazines that were being written at the time. Were being all the text being written by Ed, or largely all the text being written by Ed. I'm always hard pressed to understand who would have really read it, who would have cared. These guys were buying the magazines because there was an attractive female on the cover. This is my speculation almost entirely, but I think if they did read it, what would they even think of it? What would they think of a story like Last Laugh, which spits in their face, you're a repugnant pig as a human or as a heterosexual male?
The way I figured,
I'm over.
No, the way I figured is you spent all the money on this magazine to buy it. You spent a couple bucks on this thing. And so now you have this thing. You might as well, at this point in your life, read all the text. Because who knows, maybe you're on the can someday and you're like, yeah, what am I going to read while I'm on here? And they're flipping through this magazine and, oh, yeah, here's a story. Here's Last Laugh. And it's not like anything that you could read on public transportation. You can't read it while you're commuting or anything like that because the cover would freak people out.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't think they would think much of it. I think they would probably just, it's just text. It's there. It's something. I don't think there's some stuff that Ed's written where I think it would maybe kind of work as pornography. Like maybe it would work in that way. Nothing here. There's nothing even close to that here that you would get for that. Maybe just the idea of lesbians, if that excites you. Maybe.
I think that's a good point. I think full-on pornography, whatever you might consider full-on hardcore pornography, depending on your viewpoint, it doesn't really happen in Ed's work until the much later magazines, like 1975, 76. There's very graphic sexual elements in the magazines, even as early as the little library press magazines, which were actually, it was an offshoot of Bernie Bloom. Think of Merry-Go-Round. You're starting to get a little bit more graphic in terms of the sexual language, but really outright hardcore pornography, where it's so centered on that, doesn't happen until we get into the triple dot magazines. I think I'll give credit to Tom Brinkman, who wrote the Bad Mags books, who found those magazines, which are sort of situated between Gallery Press and the Swedish erotica mags, 1975-76 timeframe. So triple dot meaning they just have this little ellipses on the cover, and they have an editorial address, but they don't have a publishing name. So again, sort of shadow company, but very clearly they're an offshoot of all these other magazines from Pendulum, Calga, Edgesex, SECS Press, and they're a predecessor, obviously, to the Swedish erotica magazines, which become out and out hardcore, 100%.
Yeah,
and I think you can discern, and I've written a couple of articles about it, but I could tell you so much more. You could discern so much of Ed's work. And in fact, on his resume that he wrote, for, I think it's the Fred Olin Ray resume, his last paperback that he defines in that resume is called Swedish House, which is not a book. It's actually an imprint. And there were 8 Swedish House titles published by Art Publishers Incorporated, which was essentially Swedish erotica, 1978.
Well, once you get into those last couple of years of Ed's career, being an Ed Wood fan is there are challenges that you face along the way. How far are you willing to go with Ed? Are you willing to, some people are willing to follow him from like 1953 to 1960, 61.
Yeah.
Well, are you willing to go a little further? 65. Okay, now the stuff is getting a little dirtier. You're willing to go 67, 68, willing to go into like 71, 72. How far are you willing to go? You willing to go into if you're willing to go into 77, 78, if you're willing to, I don't know if there's any stuff actually from 70, maybe 78 is maybe the last stuff.
There is.
And that is a test of courage and fortitude. That is, you're going to have to, you have to say like, I'm going to dive down into the septic tank of Ed's career. Or I'm going to dive down into like the grungiest, lowest material that he put out. I'm going to put out like the most sexually explicit, sort of the least like artistic, I guess, or fanciful. Yeah. And I find among the Ed Wood fan community, you have people who will put a stop at some point. They'll stop here. I'll go up to here and no further, and up to here and no further, up to here and no further.
Yeah.
In my early years of being an Ed Wood fan, Love Feast, which was 1968 or 69 or something, it was like fairly early for Ed. That was for me at that point a bridge too far. That was like Ed Wood in his underwear crawling around on the floor and on a dog leash and stuff. That was like too much. I couldn't go all the way for that. Now, geez Louise, I've been far past it, but at the time that was as far as I was willing to go.
You're so
and when it was put out by Rhino again, and it was put out under the title Pretty Models All in a Row. And I remember getting a DVD of that and then selling that at like a used CD store or movie store, or like one of those secondhand stores at the time, because I didn't want it in my collection anymore. And then when I started doing Ed Wood Wednesdays, I had to buy it again. And I was like, oh my God, I had to buy it again. And it was more expensive that time.
Right.
It was out of print. And I was like, well,
the last laugh.
Ed got the last laugh.
You got the last laugh on your pocketbook. Interesting, because I think you're so right, Joe. I've seen people view a whole bunch of points along the way as a bridge too far. And in fact, I want to mention, I think I may have offended a friend of mine recently. I said at one of these podcasts along the way earlier that people who won't go all the way into the all-male gay mags or being quote-unquote prudes. And I think he called me out on it because he said, look, this is not my thing, right? And so I understand that, but you're absolutely right. There are these, because when you get into he did write very much so, not only for Swedish erotic mags in 1978, but he had such a backlog of material that he had written that you can find tons of material, at least being published into 1979. Again, I haven't shared all this with everybody yet, but it could have gone even a little further than that in my mind. And then the Swedish House paperbacks themselves were actually reprinted, all 8 of them. There's a mere 8 of them on that imprint, Swedish House, were all reprinted in 1989, which is fascinating to think about, right?
Just as pornography or for historical?
Straight up pornography, just another paperback on the wire rack in the porn shop. Yep. Just
Well,
recycle the material. Yep.
I will say that Last Laugh is one for people who aren't willing to go that far, who are willing to get a little dirty, but not that dirty.
Yeah.
I know Bob himself has some problems with the
yeah.
well, you know, I noticed in one of the stories, I've forgotten the title of it now, but or what the plot might have been, but just that it included an element of what is euphemistically called water sports, that fetish, and I was like, oh, okay, we are in that territory now. All right, I did not expect us. Okay, I wasn't planning on that, but now we're in that world. Okay, great. Not great, but Ed, if you want to do that, it's
Ed will push your boundaries. How about
Ed
that? Ed will push your boundaries.
Ed will push your boundaries. So the Last Laugh isn't going to hardly push anybody's boundaries. It's pretty safe stuff.
Yeah, thank you for turning it back on that, because we've gone far afield, obviously.
Yes, of course, always,
as we are wont to do. So but it's been a tremendous amount of fun, Joe. Is there anything you wanted to say, in closing before we start to wrap this up?
Just that if you have Ed Wood, if you have magazines of that era in your collection, by all means, scan them and send them to me.
Perfect. Thank you. And again, I agree. I want to echo that point, because I agree with Joe. Like I said earlier, the only way we're ever going to aggregate all this material is if we bring together a number of people. No one person is going to be able to make that heroic lift to try to catalog all this material. Can it be done? Can all of it? No. Can we catalog a lot more than we have currently? Yes, I'm very confident of that. So let's do it. Let's do it. And we'll continue to come back here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast to talk more about it. And Joe and I are actually going to be back perhaps next week. I'm hoping next week. I have it on the calendar for us to talk for next week's Ed Wood Wednesdays, to talk about Sex, Shrouds, and Caskets. His adult paperback, Sex, Shrouds, and Caskets, which having I hadn't read it in a number of years, and having given it a cursory glance recently, I was like, oh my God, this one's going to be a lot of fun. So you're not going to want to miss it, unless this is not interesting to you. But if this is even remotely interesting to you, you find it of any benefit, please join us back here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast. Joe, last words, if anything you wanted to add.
Nope. Just keep reading Ed Wood Wednesdays at d2writes.blogspot.com. I'm sure you're going to put in some links and stuff. So yeah, I hope to review a lot more stuff in this format. It's so much easier to do this than it is to write.
It really is. It's so the trade-off in time, right? In terms of efficiency, it would take for us to write everything that we just talked about over the course of the last couple of hours, which is a couple of hours of your time, and we recognize that. It would have taken us, it took us 2 hours to talk about it. It would have taken us, yes, days and days and months and things of that nature. So the only other thing I want to add to that is buy Blood Splatters quickly. Go out and buy Angora Fever when the new volume comes out with the articles in it. Buy that, because you're only going to promote more Ed Wood material coming forward. So if you're an Ed Wood fan, get behind Ed Wood, and contact us here if you have suggestions about. You can drop me a line personally. I probably shouldn't get this personal, but on Facebook, Greg Dziawer, GERGDZIAWER. If you have other material, if you have other questions, if you have things you want to talk about, I totally want to talk to you about Ed Wood. I really do. More than you know, perhaps, or it might be apparent, but we have a ton of fun doing this. I don't want to speak for Joe, but I think he agrees.
It's all
We're
fun.
gonna be back, so we'll be back here at the Ed Wood Summit podcast soon, and we appreciate your time, your patience, and have a great night.